Today's presentation will concern the production of meaning in sound art, and I don't think I will be very wrong to say that it is a subject rarely explored. Following a tradition established by Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception, the sound art discourse puts emphasis on the embodied, immersive, pre-linguistic experience of sound. However, the very same ideas of bodily experience preceding and conditioning conscious thought also ushered a shift in cognitive studies that started in 1980s and gained significant traction in recent decades. This new paradigm of embodied cognition rejected the representational model and the body-mind dualism of traditional cognitive science. Instead, the researchers posited that the body and its individual features is what, in fact, a crucial device in the production of meaning. So, in my today's presentation, I want to offer some thoughts, some directions for a hermeneutic approach to sound sculpture and an approach rooted in embodied cognition. Of course, it's an undertaking that is impossible to achieve in one short paper, and spoiler alert, in the end I have more questions than answers, but I hope I can at least work out some directions that a further and more pointed research into the subject would take. First, let's discuss some basic concepts of embodied cognition and their applicability to art in general. This story largely begins in the 1980s with the conceptual metaphor theory developed by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson in the body of works from the 80s. Lakoff and Johnson present a theory that processing the abstract notions invariably relies on previous, mostly acquired in childhood, bodily experiences. Through learning to control one's body, move through the environment and manipulate objects, individual attains a vocabulary of so-called cognitive primitives, which Lakoff and Johnson call image schemas. However, image here doesn't stand for a visual image, but this term is used more in psychological sense and can refer to any thought, any sort of sensual information, sensual image. Alternative terms have been offered in recent years, like the kinesthetic image schema or four-section schema, so to avoid these visual connotations. So, according to conceptual metaphor theory, or CMT, when we try to process abstract notions, we project the concrete physical experience, these image schemas, onto them. In other words, we manipulate concepts in largely the same way as and using the same neural circuitry as we do with a physical object. So, a specific and persistent projection of a visual experience onto an abstract notion is essentially what is called the conceptual metaphor. And so to give you an example that you'll find in any sort of primer on CMT, example of conceptual metaphor for mind is a container. Is a conceptual metaphor. So we have experience with physical containers, plainly speaking, things into which we can put other things, and which means we have the container image schema, and we envision our minds as containers into which we put different ideas. So obviously another conceptual metaphor at play here is that ideas are objects. The conceptual metaphor theory comes from cognitive linguistics, and it's been applied mostly to linguistic studies and some visual art studies. If we think about how we can apply these concepts to the acoustic domain, well, the conceptual metaphors themselves are probably better used to conceptualize the whole listening experience. Like, for example, Joshua Banks Mailman he, in his article in the Journal of Sonic Studies, he lists 7 metaphors for listening. Those are digestion, recording, adaptation, meditation, transport, improvisation, and computation. However, the image schemas, those basic elements, are quite well projected onto the sonic experience. We can easily talk about sounds in terms of lines, masses, volumes, some sort of groups maybe, and also there are aspects of sounds like the pitch, which is conceptualized in terms of height, so high or low pitch, and other things. So in early 2000s, well, not necessarily just in 2000s, the conceptual metaphor theory ventured into the field of aesthetics. When it comes to art, the traditional mind-body dichotomy that embodied cognition aims to do away with finds parallel in the dichotomy of form and meaning. And in his book, The Meaning of the Body, from 2007, Mark Johnson offers an account of cognitive aesthetics. In Johnson's view of aesthetics, the form, in fact, is the very device through which meaning is made and experienced in art, and it relies on the same embodied mechanisms as meaning-making and language. So from the point of view of CMT, form in art, and it doesn't really matter if we're speaking of visual art or music or sound art, is built on the same image schemas and that metaphors rely on. Perceiving in an artwork, we discern the image schemas involved, which in turn invokes metaphors, which is also held by the cultural cues that artworks contain, and these compose what we perceive as the meaning of the artwork. When it comes specifically to the acoustic arts, there has been another trend in the embodied cognition that comes from music cognition. So the embodied music cognition, and that specifically deals with meaning making in music. The embodied music cognition has its primary focus on the gesture rather than metaphor, which makes sense because obviously the meanings in music and sound tend to be more abstract, less expressible with words or even metaphors than those of visual art and language, and they often rely on embodied experiences. According to Mark Lehman, the gesture is a, I quote, vehicle for the construction of music-related meanings, first in our experience and next through our understanding and connection with structural features and cultural topics. In other words, musical meaning is generated in 2 stages. First, by embodying the sonic information through gestures and spatial impressions, and then by conceptualizing them. The gesture thus serves as a mediator between the physical realm of acoustic stimuli and body movements and the conceptual realm of meaning. Thus, the main difference between the concepts of gesture and image schema is that gesture is basically closer to actual physical movements and happens concurrently to perception. This allows for observation and therefore for the extension of the study of musical meaning into the territory of empirical and experimental research, which is actually what Lehman argues for. So what makes these theories particularly valuable to develop a hermeneutics of sound art and sound sculpture? As I have said in the beginning, ideas of embodiment permeate this sound art practice. The exploration of the physicality of sound and sonic experience is one of the most prominent motives in sound art. And of all genres of sound art, sound sculpture realizes this tendency to the fullest. The fascination with the materiality and even corporeality of sound can be found whenever and wherever sound sculptors talk about their work. The Bachet brothers, who can be essentially credited with the invention of sound sculpture, claimed, for example, that they aimed to bring physical phenomena into music. Peter Vogel called his works materialite score. Bernhard Leitner, of whom I will be talking in more detail below, investigated the spatiality of the body through sound. In fact, the very term sound sculpture implies that there is a tangible corporeal quality to the sounds involved in this art form. In essence, sound sculpture is defined by the unity of sound and a physical object, and the mode of perception it implies is both listening and physical action simultaneously. Obviously, this kind of experience is no better suited to the traditional methods of interpretation than music, which has always remained hermeneutically problematic, so to say. Sound sculpture is arguably even more problematic because it lacks the cultural conventions that have been traditionally used to make sense of music. And moreover, the emphasis on the corporeal experience means that the symbolic side of things gets downplayed. In other words, in the case of sound sculpture, we don't even have the object that the traditional interpretative methodologies could be applied to. However, the apparatus of embodied cognition arguably allows to circumvent this apparent lack of symbolic layer, in a sense to reverse engineer it from the bodily experiences and the few cultural cues that sound sculpture does give us. If we analyze the movement patterns and all sorts of schemas and shapes that compose sound sculpture, we can work our way up to the meanings that rely on these cognitive primitives. Arguably, sound sculpture is even better suited for this kind of analysis than traditional art forms, as all those movemental bodily features are much more pronounced here. Okay, so let's have an example with a completely randomly selected sound sculpture. It's Lucas Abela's Gamelan Wizard from 2015. Shoot clip. So this work is a sense of peculiar mix of a pinball machine and a gamelan instrument. So I guess I won't play it fully, you'll get the idea. And how do I close it? Here. Oh, here. So what can we do with this work? How can we what can we say about this work in terms of image schemas, metaphors, and gestures? So the whole sculpture has basically a round shape, technically octagonal, but this difference here is not very important, which is associated with the horizontal, non-hierarchical structures and relationships. Like, for example, we can remember the Knights of the Round Table discussions, so these sort of metaphors. The gamelan bells are at the center, which invokes the metaphor that lack of designates as important is center. In his opinion, one of the most fundamental metaphors, and it points to the central role sound plays in the whole experience. The ball's back and forth movements between the players and the bells are basically an image schema in themselves, one that, for example, a concept of dialogue relies on. The flippers, acting as extensions of players' arms, move in this kind of fashion, suggesting openness. Finally, the sounds produced by the bells. They have a short pronounced attack, which corresponds to the image schema of a hit. And in the context of a game, this can be associated with achievement and reward, but at the same time, there are no competitive elements here. And the bell sounds also have long, rich, resonant tails, invoking the ideas of cosmic harmony, especially in the context of referring to the traditional cultures of the East. Thus, the work can be read in a way as a political statement on the value of horizontal cross-cultural dialogue and harmonious coexistence. This is, of course, just one layer of meaning because, for example, a lot of elements I described here, the circle and center structure, the back and forth movements, the rhythm of the bells, these elements often figure in the metaphors that involve time. There's some temporal symbolism to this work as well. Such reverse engineering, of course, relies on the interpreter's mind, in this case, personal experience, personal cognitive circuitry, personal biases, and the way abstract and concrete domains are linked in the interpreter's mind. My account of Abela's work should probably have been in first person. And the only reason I didn't do it was to save time. These accounts tend to be rather verbose. These limitations are fine. After all, hermeneutics is always as much about the interpreter as it is about their object of interpretation. However, where hermeneutics in general and embodied cognitive aesthetics in particular fails sound sculpture is in not accounting for the interactivity of the work. In other words, in my analysis, I discerned the elements and offered an interpretation of their combination, of their sum. But did I account for the whole experience? Can I even do that given the variability of this experience? And this variability and interactivity is very characteristic of sound sculpture. The Bachet brothers named audience participation as one of the core components of the this art form, and this is a tendency that is present to varying degrees in all sound sculptures. On the other hand, in the approaches to art suggested by Lakoff, Johnson and Lehman, the artwork is always an invariable given. The process of aesthetic cognition they describe involves the body only after the primary sensory information has been received. Essentially, while the process of meaning-making in these theories is embodied, the objects, the artwork that is being made sense of, remains purely symbolic. But in case of sound sculpture, the body's role in the act of perception, which is at the same time co-creation, is impossible to ignore. In Abela's work, the participatory aspect is limited to pressing the two buttons and the sounds remain more or less uniform. Let's look at an example where it's more pronounced, both in terms of gestures involved and their effect on the sonic result. So here's a short clip of Peter Vogel's sound wall. So, as you can see, in this work, the sounding elements are triggered by the listener's shadow, triggering the photosensitive elements. Vogel's works are very interesting in that they essentially function as both musical instruments and graphic musical scores at the same time. Among the many, the photosensitive elements reacting to listener shadows mean that these sculptures can be at the same time viewed, listened to, performed and played on, and there is a rather wide and really unlimited vocabulary of gestures that can be involved in the process. Embodied music cognition does study music making gestures, however, it does so from the point of view of the professional performer, someone who possesses a musical skill, who knows what her instrument sounds like and what she wants to play. The difference can be shown by the way Lehman describes musical practice. So he describes an image in his book. So the figure shows a viol player in action. In playing a musical goal, is turned into a biomechanical energy, which is then transformed into sonic energy. Through feedback loops, the viol player will be able to handle the viol as an extended body part so that he can focus on the goals of sound performing gestures rather than having to focus on the execution of the sound performing gestures on the mediator. Obviously, this is not something that happens in case of sound wall. Of course, if a viewer of this sound sculpture is a trained musician, he or she will be able to read the arrangement of electronic components as a score and throw a professional performance. But a layperson most certainly would not. I think I'm short on time, yeah?
No, I mean there's 9 minutes in total left, so...
9 minutes, okay, so I think I should skip a couple of paragraphs. Sorry. In a way, the embodied cognition approaches do not account for this sort of interactivity, for this sort of bodily involvement. This is, of course, not to say that everything I've said before should be discarded. Embodied cognition still holds significant explanatory power we can use to deal with sound sculpture, arguably more so than any other hermeneutic methodology. However, to apply it correctly, one should make an accommodation for what can be called corporeality of listening. I'm here adapting Bernhard Leitner's term. His work you can see on this picture. Leitner spoke of corporeal hearing, Körperhören, a term which implies that we perceive sound not only with our ears but with our whole bodies. And Leitner explored this phenomenon in many of his works, the most famous of which is the sound chair, where we have a chair into which, in various versions of this work, 2 to 6 loudspeakers were built into, and the sound moves from the listener's feet to the head and back. Here we obviously have a very complex interplay of gestures. The movements of sound through the body, the movements in the musical material, however simple they may be, and finally the attention shifts, but probably most importantly the attention shifts within the space of the body that might not follow the movement of the sound. And the similar complexity concerns image schemas, as some experimental research with the sound chair has shown that a listener on the sound chair loses the perception of up and down and experiences a sort of floating. So, okay. So, where does the corporeal... forgot to say that basically the sort of innate gestures that Leitner's corporeal hearing implies and the external gestures that we saw in case of Vogel's work can be basically regarded as two sides of the same phenomenon. This phenomenon of corporeal listening that is dialogic and that involves the body as an active agent. Where does this sort of listening leave us in terms of hermeneutics of sound sculpture? Since corporeal listening is invariably a dialogical experience where the sound directly affects the body and the body directly affects the sound, or at least what is heard, so in this case the gestures and image schemas invoked by the work collide with those involved in the actual physical interactions with it. Which means that the meaning produced in this process is invariably unsettled, multi-layered, and oftentimes contradictory. To account for this reciprocity, for this multifacetedness, multiple paths one can take through the work, And given the huge role bodily experience plays in the making sense of sound sculpture, I think this bodily experience should actually become a part of the interpretation process. The methodology of hermeneutics of sound sculpture should become closer to science, which seems fitting given the scientific roots of the concepts I use here, embodied cognition. A researcher of meaning making in sound sculpture could rely either on multiple first-person accounts where they are available, or better yet, they could perform sort of experiment and rely on their own involvement with an artwork, but involvement that is informed, that is prepared in the methodology of embodied cognition, and involvement that is also aware of the multiple paths, multiple ways this experience of this artwork could take. Thank you.
We just have a few minutes for questions. I would no, because I'm interested in this the metaphor concept you were talking about. You explored the Lake of Johnson approach, and what struck me was that you probably know more about this than I do. But I remember reading the linguistics of Talmy and Gilles Fauconnier, who developed the concept, and also Mark Turner, who talks about the mental space concept. And that whole idea of a blend as a sort of a cognitive operation where it's not as a metaphor of a projection of that the mind is a container in terms of where you project the idea of a container onto the mind, but rather that you have two different worlds, so to speak, the mind world and the container world, and then a much more complex structure actually emerges from this.
Yeah, surely.
And I was thinking about that because the examples that you have all seems to involve a kind of a blend. So this is a chair, but it's also a loudspeaker. This is a pinball machine, but also an instrument. The shadow playing operation is something, a structure on the wall that can also be played as if it was an instrument. So it seems that there are these processes in the examples that you have a certain structure. And I just wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the. I was curious, actually.
Are you asking if we can actually regard these works as metaphors in themselves?
Yeah, I mean, if they have actually, I mean, they obviously a chair like that, it invites to sit as if it was a chair. But at the same time, it also invites a listening. So it seems to have a multiple set of meanings.
Yes, probably. That's the whole problem with the hermeneutic approach to these kind of works, because the meaning is very multiple, is very varied, and can be contradictory even. So, yes, this is true.
I was just curious if it might be something you have worked with.
No, it's this actually this whole project is a bit of a work in progress. So it's probably there is much more yet to do in this direction than I have already done.
But I think it's a super interesting approach to actually this particular kind of structure that has that. You also said that it's we get confused by the context quite often because we have to develop a context for where these work actually fit, but there's a certain immediacy that they are understandable as objects also, even though they're strange objects, makes them approachable in this bodily sense maybe.
Yes, probably.
I think there's something really interesting in thinking this metaphorical approach to this.
Yeah.
Any other? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.